The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse have lined up another giveaway, open to anyone who switches their electricity supplier to Fuse.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics when you sign up.
And this time we're putting some merch bundles together for them. I'm thinking hoodies, sweatshirts, hats. If you came to see us on tour, you might have seen some of it already.
But aside from the prizes, well worth considering switching to Fuse. Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money even though the price cap has gone up.
And the great thing is, Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables, which means they're planning for a clean energy future.
It will take you just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up. Fuse will also handle everything with your old supplier, so you won't have to lift a finger.
So download the Fuse app now and use referral code POLITICS after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more. Welcome to the Rest is Politics question time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Great question from Franco Patricolo. Will the destruction of British farming be Rachel Reeves' legacy, just like Mrs Thatcher's destruction of the coal industry? Before I hand to you, Rory, I'm just going to say no. But anyway.
So I'm going to say yes, although of course it doesn't, there aren't as many farmers as there were people working in the coal industry. But one of the things they have in common is that in both cases, governments are coming in when there's actually been many, many years of decline already. So what Margaret Thatcher did to the coal industry reflected the fact that through the 70s, the coal industry was already in severe crisis. The Labour government's taken over at the end of a period where, in fundamental terms, leaving the European Union was a death blow to British farmers. So long as we were part of the EU, France, Greece, many other places that had big farm bases, nearly 10% of the French population is connected with farming even on a part-time basis, basically set out with laws to protect small family farms. And they did it through two types of things. I know this for a couple of reasons. One of them is I was the MP for an agricultural constituency, but then I was also the minister in DEFRA during this period. So there were two things. There was something called a single farm payment, which basically just gave you money per hectare of land, regardless really of what you did in it. And the second thing were these agri-environmental payments, which gave you money for the kind of things you were doing with your land. When Britain left the European Union, and I was still working at DEFRA, I was at DEFRA when we left, we were spending over £3 billion annually on support to our farmers.
Sorry, how did that relate to the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy?
It came right out of the core of that.
This was
absolutely.
These were the two most important elements for the UK of the CAP.
Absolutely. And one of the problems was that there was a huge opposition to the CAP from two sides. There was opposition from the Tory right that didn't like subsidies and wanted to, and Liz Truss, who was the DEFRA secretary, was one of these big ones. Why should we subsidise farmers? Let the private, free market rip. And the other opposition was from environmentalists who felt that the CAP was keeping alive environmentally unfriendly farming practices. So the fantasy from the right was that you would go to sort of full American Kansas-style industrial farming. And the fantasy from the environmental left was you'd basically abandon all the land and you'd go over to rewilding. You just let trees grow naturally. And the group that's completely squeezed by this, of course, are the small farmers, because the small farmers are neither these huge, big industrial operations, nor are they able to make 200 or 300 acres work by simply letting trees grow. And for me, farming is our landscape, our soil, our nature, our biodiversity. And I'd love, if I could convince you sometime, to get somebody like James Rebanks, who's an incredibly eloquent, small-scale farmer in Cumbria, talking about the transformations he's brought in with nature-friendly farming. And the real goodwill effort a lot of these small farmers made to try to make this vision work, prove that they could produce food, which we need, because we learned from Russia, Ukraine, that actually this idea that we don't need to worry about food security isn't quite true. We do need to produce some of our own food, but do it in a way that respected nature and encouraged nature developments. The problem for them now is they're being hit by a lot of problems they inherited from the last government. Particularly, the government hasn't uprated the kind of support they got from Europe. It's been eroded by inflation. They're getting much, much less income. Now we have a Labour government coming in that's hit them in another way, which is inheritance tax on farms. If you've got a 300-acre farm, which is a very small farm in modern day terms in somewhere like Wiltshire, and you try to hand it on over to your next generation, you'll be having about £500,000 worth of inheritance tax. And the paradox of this is that farms are on very low incomes. Many of the farms in my constituency were living on £15,000, £16,000 a year, even if their land was worth a lot. And they're doing it because they're trying to keep something going for profound love of their ancestors, of the land, of the work of farming. But it's not a financially workable system. And that's why almost every other country in the world, from Japan right the way through to France, supports farmers, and why I'm very worried about the direction in which things are going in the UK.
So on the inheritance tax, I mean, these protests are specifically about the changes to the inheritance tax in the budget, where the government insists that most farmers will not be affected. And you look, this is now a campaign, okay? And sometimes in campaigns, the facts get lost. There becomes a battle of the narrative. The farmers are pretty well organised.
Yep.
They've got a lot of very high-profile supporters. I've got to say, when you just said that about Brexit, there is something pretty nauseating about the way that the politicians on the right who fought for Brexit now standing up as trying to be the voices of the farmer, given that what they did so much damage to farming in this country. And there is no debate about that.
Absolutely. And also very sad that many farmers in my constituencies voted for Brexit
because they were desperate about...
And also annoyed by EU regulations. But the fundamental truth, which needed to be got across and we failed to get across in the campaign, is that the best protection for small British farmers was small farmers in other parts of Europe. Look, I don't know why the government's saying most people won't be affected. Because of land values, which are now at least £5,000-6,000 an acre, and in many cases going up to £10,000 an acre, even what in modern terms would be a very small farm, would be affected by this change. And I think that may be a question of something where somebody in the Treasury did some back-of-the-envelope maths, briefed the Chancellor, told her that very few small farmers would be affected. And I think it's also going to matter because Labour's taken a lot of rural seats.
Yeah, the farmers did sort of swing behind Labour at the last election.
Yes, and, you were very pleased to get, we interviewed the head of the National Farmers Union.
Batters,
and you often talked about the fact that farmers were pro-Labour. So I'm hoping this is something that Labour can do a retreat on, because it would be a pity.
Tweak or retreat?
I'm not saying she's going to do this, but let's say I gave you the uncomfortable job, pulled you in and said to you in number 10, listen, okay, we don't really need a fight with the farmers at the moment, and we're not actually going to make that much money off this. How would we set about doing something that gets goodwill again from the farmers and puts this issue to bed? How would you do that?
I think you'd tweak it. It's a little bit like the winter fuel thing with this one. I felt there was an argument for what they did on winter fuel. But once they'd launched it and announced it, they kind of let others take over the debate. And I think that's happening with this. You've got to engage in the debate on the facts, because the facts get lost. As you started to talk when it was the first question, I just kind of, went on the laptop and I looked at the BBC report of the protest. From April 26, inherited agricultural assets worth more than £1 million, which were previously exempt, will be liable to the tax at 20%, half the usual rate. Okay, that's complicated to take in.
Yeah.
And it's easy then for the numbers to be kind of, used against either side.
Yeah.
That's where government this is, again, I'm afraid, a communications issue. That is where government has to take the trouble to make sure that people understand what the policy is, because the facts get lost. Once you're into campaign, you get so-called celebrities involved and the rest of it, the facts get lost. So I think you have to remake and re-win the argument. And if you can't, you tweak it. And I don't think you can retreat from this.
You can tweak, though.
You can definitely tweak it.
So sometimes it's not always necessary to say, my credibility is at stake, I'm going to stubbornly hold to 100% of this. Sometimes it's actually good to give a little bit of ground through a tweak.
Yeah, absolutely. As we did, for example, on pensions, when we were so successful at keeping interest in inflation low, that the inflation link to the pension meant we were giving pensioners a rise of 75p. And there was a massive protest about it.
So how does
Gordon Brown tweaked it.
Yeah, how does that work in Downing Street when the Secretary of State, maybe even the Prime Minister, is saying, I don't want to give an inch on this because my credibility is at stake. I want to seem strong. I don't want to look like I'm intimidated by protesters. How do you judge when it's right to tweak and give a little ground?
I think in the end it's a question of political instinct and political judgment. We said day one, if you remember, on the podcast at the budget, I'd watch this farming thing. Whether they will or not, I don't know. Listen, you can ride a lot out. You can ride a lot out. But given that the farmers were traditionally pro-Brexit, pro-Tory, and that there was a significant shift, then I just think it's not good politics to have them all offside. Now, and bear in mind, these protests will be weaponised by the far right and by the right of the Tory party. It's already happened. And there is an argument, I mentioned the book Who Owns Scotland. I don't know if there's one for England, but Who Owns Scotland basically is about, who owns the land in Scotland. It's a pretty small number of people.
Yeah.
And it's often a pretty small number of corporations and, people, non-doms and all this sort of stuff. That argument has to be out there as well. That doesn't mean you're attacking small farmers, but you've got to have an honest argument about who owns land, how much they contribute back, how farming is done. Because if you're the government, you don't have that argument, you end up just looking like the guy who's sort of, hitting, as you say, the small farmer. But let's take this then from Aidan Gregory. With all that's happening in Sudan, Yemen, Gaza, Ukraine and elsewhere, do you think international humanitarian law has collapsed after more than 8 decades? And I might add to that, if it is collapsing, does Donald Trump's re-election aid the collapse?
It very much aids the collapse. So what's the most dramatic example of collapse is Gaza. What is happening in Gaza, I think, will prove over the next 20 years to be more consequential than any other event we've seen, more than the Iraq War, more than the Afghan War. We are totally underestimating the way that people in the Muslim world feel about what's happening in Gaza and a lot of the global south. The way that I think it has discredited the US, it's discredited the international backers. And in recent surveys in Saudi Arabia, over 90% of Saudi respondents put Gaza as their number one issue. At the same time, Israel has declared the Secretary General of the United Nations persona non grata. We have a government coming in with Trump, with an ambassador
who doesn't believe who says he believes in the one-state solution.
Absolutely. And Trump, of course, last time round was the first US president ever to publicly reject the two-state solution, move the US embassy to Jerusalem, accept settlements in international law. I mean, he started this whole stuff and then pushed through the Abraham Accords, which were very, very favorable towards Israel. He's now back in again. And he's back in again with a government that is even harder over on that particular very, very right-wing Israeli perspective on this conflict. And I cannot see how international law really survives. He's challenging the International Criminal Court. He's going to probably defund UNRWA. He's appointed to an ambassador to the UN, somebody who's incredibly critical of the entire UN system. So this is something we just talked about in an interview that we did with Ian Bremmer. What other international mechanisms emerge to replace what now, I'm afraid, really feels so shabby and discredited? My friend Tom Fletcher is about to start as a big UN envoy. Sorry, he's actually Deputy Secretary General, one of the most senior people in the United Nations. It's good on him taking on that job, but it feels very tough at the moment. Here's a question from Molly D. How long will the fallout after the violent clashes between Ajax and Maccabi Tel Aviv fans in Amsterdam be? Give us a brief reminder of what happened during that event and what the political consequences have been.
Well, first of all, Rory, it's pronounced Ajax.
Ajax?
One of the most famous football names in the world.
Oh, dear.
So we talked about this, and the question, how long will it go on? It's still going on. So just to go back, there was this terrible violence between Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters playing Ajax, and some of it was clearly Palestinian, Israel-Palestine driven. There was some really pretty horrific stuff going on, both sides.
And am I right that actually sometimes in Rangers Celtic matches and in Dundee matches, you get some of the same of people flying Palestinian flags, flying Israeli flags? It's a phenomenon in Scottish football as well. Yeah,
the Celtic Green Brigade regularly fly Palestinian flags. But this was more. Maccabi Tel Aviv do have a bit of a reputation. Their fans.
A reputation for what? For being very right-wing Zionist.
Yeah, and also being quite prone to violence.
Right.
Ajax similarly.
And Ajax similar reputation being sort of left-wing prone to violence, more pro-Palestinian?
No, just
just
football violence. Football violence, yeah. The Dutch have quite a reputation for football violence. So the violence goes off and it is really pretty bad. There's then a real battle of the narrative about who started it, who was the worst and so forth. And that's kind of continued to go on.
And that's the stuff I've seen on social media where there was a flurry of people saying that this had been the most outrageous example of anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
and senior Dutch politicians were criticizing the anti-Semitism, and then there was a counterblast from people saying, no, the Ajax fans had made incredibly aggressive anti-Muslim, anti-Palestinian
The
comments.
Maccabi
Sorry,
Tel
Maccabi
Aviv fans,
fans,
yeah. And all of those things were true.
Right.
Okay. The Maccabi Tel Aviv were ripping down Palestinian flags
Yeah.
from windows. They were singing really horrible
Yeah.
chants about why are there no schools in Gaza because there are no children left, all this sort of stuff. Horrible.
And on the other side, there was anti-Semitic violence. Then we had a sequence of attacks on, I think it was railway carriages.
Yeah. So you had things like that. You had a Muslim taxi driver being attacked, his car being kicked, him being hit with leather belts. Word went round. Lots of Muslim taxi drivers think, well, we've got to get involved. So it sort of spread like that. But then what happened on the political front with this rather weird four-party coalition that, remember, Geert Wilders topped the poll, but the other parties wouldn't serve with him.
The far-right politician in the Netherlands, yeah.
So then what happened is that because of things that he was saying, essentially saying
and
this is all...
He's always been very anti-Muslim.
Very. And he was basically saying this was all the fault of Dutch Moroccans. As a result of which, a minister of Moroccan descent, Noura Akhabar, resigned from the government. And this is a very fragile government. So she resigned. There were rumours of lots of other resignations were going to happen. The Prime Minister called a crisis meeting, and the Prime Minister managed to calm it down for now. So the government is sort of held intact. But it's a bad scene, and it's exposed all sorts of rifts and divisions within the coalition, but also within Dutch politics and Dutch society more generally.
Next question directed at you from Alice. Is Keir Starmer spending too much time abroad?
I would say no to that one as well. I can see why people say that. He's the Prime Minister. People have elected him to sort out the economy, sort out the health service, sort out schools, rebuild the infrastructure. But I think if you look at them one by one, first of all, you and I regularly say he's got to build better relations with the European Union. Well, you don't do that by sending a few texts and emails. You've got to sit down. You've got to have really good quality time, one-on-one with people. And these like this G20 or COP.
Just to remind people on G20, so that's just happened in Brazil.
Yeah.
And the very interesting thing at the centre of this is that Keir Starmer had a meeting with Xi Jinping. Now, this is very interesting because it shows how marginalised Britain has become. China is the world's second largest economy, and in purchasing power parity terms, possibly the world's largest economy. And in 6 years, Boris Johnson didn't manage to meet Xi Jinping. Liz Truss didn't manage to meet Xi Jinping. Rishi Sunak didn't manage to meet Xi Jinping. So it's a big deal that Keir Starmer's met him. And he's come out of it talking quite sort of positively about how, we agreed that we believe in a predictable, consistent, sovereign actors committed to the rule of law. We're going to avoid surprises. So quite friendly language coming out of the meeting with Xi Jinping. What did you make of that? And what challenges might that pose, given that Trump's bringing in a very anti-China White House?
Well, we actually had a question on this. Ross from Ipswich. The UK needs to attach itself to a large dynamic market. Europe isn't growing. That leaves the US or China as markets to attach ourselves to. The US doesn't want to play ball right now. Maybe a bold move to strengthen relations with China would force them to take a UK-US trade deal more seriously. I think Ross is a chess player. I think it was a good thing that he met Xi Jinping. And that's why these summits sometimes can be very, very effective. We had a question about COP, somebody saying, is COP actually worthwhile? And I sent you last week Edi Rama, the Albanian Prime Minister, his speech at COP. It was almost saying, what is the point here? We all come here, we all sit in the lounge watching a screen where the speaker who's in the forum is speaking. Nobody's watching, nobody's listening. We're all just chatting to each other about other stuff. Now, there is a use to that. There is a use to that. There's a value to that.
But the challenge was from Dave Smulders, who asked the question, as Al Gore has reminded everyone this year, the 3 most recent COP summits have been hosted by petro-states and marred by controversy. The optics, at the very least, suggest a model for international dialogue and agreement is broken. Is this event actually necessary? Is there a better way to achieve international climate cooperation?
I think COP is a part of it. But ultimately, let's just take China again. The US and China, the 2 biggest emitters in the world. It may be that ultimately this is something else that Trump has to try and sort out bilaterally. Now, his views suggest that he's not up for it, but they will have to be involved in that. So I think COP is part of a process. It's not the be-all and end-all. But if you go through all the meetings that Keir Starmer's had, and yes, people would rather see him at home. Yes, people want to see him focused on domestic issues. But he has to make the argument, because it's right, that growth does depend on us having good relations with these countries. So the big foreign policy stuff, we talked about Ukraine in the main podcast. Every single one of the conversations there at the G20, they'll all be talking about Trump. They'll all be talking about, what do we do in relation to Middle East, in relation to Ukraine, in relation to AI? Trump changes the game. Now, therefore, he has to engage in that. What he has to watch out for is the fact that the workload is so intense on the foreign policy front. If you start to give the impression to the public that that's what you prefer, you actually like being on a plane, you like the red carpet when you're arriving in country A or country B. So you've always got to be linking what you do as a foreign policy prime minister to what you're doing domestically. And I think he's doing that pretty well.
China. I'm just looking at a couple of figures which I think are quite interesting on this. So the Brexiteers made a huge play. Here's this huge economy, China, growing reasonably fast, and European Union isn't growing that fast. Why don't we do more with China? The raw facts are that we have astonishingly little trade and investment with China. So to put it in context, our imports from the EU are almost 500 billion, half a trillion annually. Our trade with China has increased from 20 billion up to 31.5 billion. Foreign direct investment from China into the UK is 4.3 billion pounds. That's 0.2% of UK inward investment. It's 1/500th. Whereas from the US, would you rough guess? Maybe it's unfair to you. Anyway, answer
A
is
lot more.
A lot. 34%.
Yeah.
So that is 150 times greater.
So the answer to Ross is that would not be a sensible thing to do. Added to which, it would damage us with Europe and the US. I mean, Cameron and Osborne sort of tried a version of it, didn't they?
Tried to, and I got a fascinating insight into this because I've been meeting quite a lot of senior Chinese officials, and there's something I didn't realize. They talked about a golden age, and famously, Cameron took Xi Jinping for a beer and all this kind of stuff. What I hadn't realized is that I was told by this Chinese person 10 years after the event that when David Cameron met the Dalai Lama, the instruction went out quietly in China to all the senior Chinese state-owned enterprises, we're not making any investment in Britain.
Yeah.
And for 10 years, George Osborne and Cameron were sitting there expecting this investment to come. Actually, they weren't there for 10 years, but anyway, for 10 years, British governments were expecting this investment to come, and it never came. And the Chinese wouldn't explain why. But the story that I heard, this is very deep background, but I believe my source, was that they were absolutely told that as soon as Cameron met the Dalai Lama, no Chinese investment has come to the UK.
I did notice Keir in his statement said that, they always say this, he raised the issue of human rights and the Uyghurs and so forth.
We've talked about that a bit in the past. It's an odd thing that, because I often went into meetings as a Foreign Office Minister with governments, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Myanmar, etc., raising human rights. And the question is, how do you do it? Because often what it is just one speaking point amongst 8 that you've got. And one of the African leaders challenged me directly on this. He said, you don't care about human rights. And I said, what do you mean I don't care about it? I just raised human rights with you. And he said, no, you're just giving us another 40 million pounds of development aid. So you don't really care about human rights, do you?
Interesting.
And often, literally, it is, you will remember this, it'll be raise human rights and then ask them to approve a British investment of, X billion pounds to help some British company.
Yeah, so no, the human rights thing. So I may have told you this before, but at the Hong Kong handover, we had to travel to go and see the Chinese. And all our media cared about was, will Tony Blair raise human rights? Will he press them on human rights? And I was getting inundated with press. So because, yes, of course he will do that. So we get there. And as you say, you've got a list of things that you've got to say. And Robin Cook was Foreign Secretary. I remember him bristling as the meeting went on and Tony had not yet mentioned human rights. And at one point, John Holmes, Tony's advisor, sort of just scribbles human rights on a piece of paper, sort of shuffles it along across like that. And so we've done all the Hong Kong and the business and all the rest of it. And by the way, we should point out, it's horrific what's happened to these democracy guys in Hong Kong. They've been given these very long jail sentences. So Tony finally sort of, and I can feel it, it's coming. And he's saying, so it's just one more, if I could just raise this, with respect, just raise this issue, and they can feel it's coming as well. And that's the question of, and he's just got the first half of the H out, and Li Peng, who was the Chinese Prime Minister, takes a handkerchief out of his pocket and just spits into his handkerchief as a way of drowning out Tony Blair raising human rights. And then, of course, I go back to the press and they say, did he? Yes, he raised human rights.
Yeah.
So
Well, I'm glad you're honest about it, because we were guilty of this as a Conservative government just as much. And I'm afraid this is something that journalists don't fully understand. When they ask that question, did you raise human rights? And we say yes. Of course, the journalist is never in the room. And the real question is, what actually is the dynamics in that room? How central are you making it?
Yeah.
What kind of carrots and sticks are you attaching to it?
I think that's why sometimes, when you have these meetings, you have this is why it's quite good, the American system, where they bring in what they call the spray pool at the top. So the two leaders will be standing, shaking hands, or sitting in a chair, and you throw questions. And sometimes that will be the point at which a leader can signal what the priorities are. So Tony, when he did the brief, when I did the briefing afterwards and Tony did interviews, he would talk about the human rights issues and present them in that context of a broader relationship. Like you say with the Cameron Osborne thing, it's very hard to get the balance right. Then we had your friend when he was Prince Charles, when Jiang Zemin came here for a state visit, do you remember? And Charles basically said he's not turning up for the dinner. No, he couldn't do that as the king, could he?
No. There's also a problem here, which is that we've been talking about this issue now for well over 30 years. And has it made any difference? Has China remotely changed its attitude towards Tibet, towards Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, towards its own internal distance? And it's not just the British government will raise it. Every European leader, every Canadian leader, every US leader will raise it in the meetings. And so the question really is, in the optimistic story, we're chipping away, and by raising it in every meeting over 30 years, eventually something filters through. But I question whether that really is the case. Okay, here's a question for you. Chantal, what will happen if Marine Le Pen is barred from standing in France's 2027 election?
Which may happen. If people aren't aware of this, Marine Le Pen is in court. Court case is going on now. Should be a judgment in the next couple of weeks. And the basic charge is that she and colleagues embezzled European Union funds, which were meant to be for their work as MEPs, hiring advisors, aides, who were there working for them as MEPs, but that money was actually going to their party to help pay off people and whatever. She denies it, and some of I watched some of it on TV the other day. Some of the fellow defendants were giving very, very unconvincing answers. As to what will happen, the prosecutors are asking for, I think it's 5 years in jail, 3 suspended, €300,000 fine, and barred from office for 5 years. So if she is convicted and is barred from office for 5 years, the consequences are obvious. She can't stand against whoever stands in the presidential election. She is playing a less voluble, more subtle version of the Trump game plan. She and her supporters are essentially saying this is a political witch hunt. They're out to get us because they don't want her to stand. But it's very, very interesting. And, it's one of those where ultimately the verdict will decide what the implications are.
And we're reminded by Trump's re-election of the stakes of this. I mean, if Congress had managed to impeach Trump successfully, if that hadn't just been swung by a couple of Republican senators refusing to go along, we would not be in the mess we are today. That was the great hope, that you could disqualify Trump from standing. And what an enormous difference that
and
would
also
have made.
People talk about the guardrails. Right, well, they had 4 years for the justice and the legal system actually to get him to face justice. He faced it to some extent in relation to the stuff he got convicted for, but in relation to January 6th, the classified documents, all that stuff, that's all now going away.
And do you agree with me that had they succeeded in impeaching him, the likelihood is actually that you would have had a more moderate Republican candidate?
I just don't know, because I don't know I don't know the extent to which the Republican Party is already so Trumpified that they would have just carried on in that same direction. I
suppose my idea is that immediately after January 6th, quite a lot of Republicans were beginning to distance.
Yeah.
He'd lost the election.
Yeah.
That was actually a moment to regroup the soul of the Republican
But he somehow managed to turn enough people in his own direction to keep going. I think you and I both thought at the time, that's it, at least he's finished. But, far from it. So I think the thing about Le Pen is, and of course, if Le Pen, let's just say Le Pen doesn't lose this case, and let's say she does win the next French presidential election. Here's an interesting point, which actually we discussed with Ian Bremmer. The next G7 after that, you will have Trump, Italy, Meloni, Japan, a new conservative right-wing prime minister, Canada, probably Pierre Poilievre rather than Trudeau, right-wing, Le Pen,
Germany, CDU.
Germany will not be Scholz.
Yeah.
It will be like that with CDU.
Yeah.
So Keir Starmer will be the only left of centre progressive leader at that event. And
In the whole G7.
Yeah.
So, lovely question from Craig. What have we been watching recently? A couple of things. On telly, I've been watching this very disturbing Netflix series on Jeffrey Epstein. Before we get onto that, though, I went to see the Dylan concert at the Royal Albert Hall.
Did he get as big a crowd as we did?
He did, indeed. He got the same crowd that we did. He'd filled the Royal Albert Hall comfortably. I was sitting right up in the cheap seats up at the top and thinking about what a strange place it was to perform in. You didn't go, right?
No.
No. But you've been to see a lot of music concerts.
Yeah, loads. Yeah, I've never really been a massive Bob Dylan fan.
The way in which it was done was astonishing. It was very, very poorly lit. He'd spent about £10 on the stage decorations. There was a sort of folded cloth at the back. He had an amazing band with him. He sung his songs with the same lyrics, but he changed the tunes. And of course, unless you know them very well, you can't hear what he's saying.
Are you a big Bob Dylan fan?
A mild Bob Dylan fan.
Is Shoshana a big?
Yes, she's a Bob.
Right,
Dylan. She's
okay.
a big Bob Dylan fan. Yeah.
Yeah.
But even Shoshana, who knows all the songs very well, you're getting about 1 word in 3 if you're lucky. And the audience was, I would say, about 85% men. And it was really like a sort of almost religious experience. They were all leaning forward, looking very, very earnest. Judging by, I don't want to offend them at all, because an enormous number of them came up and said they listened to our podcast. There seemed to be an almost 100% overlap between going to the Bob Dylan
But
concert.
our audience is young.
Well, I'm not saying they weren't young. There were a lot of young men.
Oh, you
there.
gave me a sense when you talk about stooped over and listening.
No, just earnest men. And they literally, as he made his way through songs where there was barely a discernible tune and where you couldn't hear a single word, and he's lit very poorly.
So he's just sort of muttering.
Yeah, but it was like a 3-hour sort of flamenco or no Japanese drama performance where the sort of strange symbolism of catching 1 word in 3 and when he finally got out his harmonica, played a tiny amount on his mouth organ, the whole place erupted in cheers when he played about sort of 4 notes on it, because this was the most exciting thing that had happened in 3 hours.
The other thing, Rory, that I'm sure as a fellow Scot you watch as well, is Scotland winning 2 football matches in the last few days. I'm sure you watch both.
Absolutely, yeah. This was something you've got in common. I don't want to say this with Donald Trump, but one of the things that comes across all these books I've been reading about Trump is that he's always interrupting meetings to watch the sport. He's always like, I'm really sorry, the Masters tournament is on. I cannot talk about North Korea.
Oh, I wouldn't do that. I did sometimes when we were number 10. I was capable of, if I couldn't do it with football because you have to concentrate, but I quite often had the cricket in the background.
Right.
If there's a test match in the background, I'd have that on. But I wouldn't leave a meeting to watch it.
Okay, my point about Epstein and the documentary. I mean, horrifying Netflix documentary. But one of the things that worried me is that these documentaries are incredibly popular, and I suspect, we're thinking about some of the people voting for Donald Trump, they play quite neatly into a lot of the conspiracy theories, because this is a story about a man who, as the documentary explains, basically tried to buy out the police, convince the FBI not to investigate, continued for nearly 10, 15 years with his money, inviting very famous people, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, and many, many others to his island. And it gives a very, very unpleasant impression of the way in which the elite and money can sort of protect itself. Because it's not mainstream, because a lot of this is being covered in bits of social media, YouTube, I think we're underestimating that. And we're underestimating the fact that, we feel pretty smug about the fact that this podcast often gets more listeners than a regular CNN show. Joe Rogan is getting something astonishing like 20 million downloads. And that 3-hour conversation with Trump, that the demographic there that really made the difference to Trump's election, young men turning out, coming out of that. So I just think we're missing so many bits. The sort of media landscape is consuming from us all these stories which come from people watching Netflix documentaries on Epstein. Quickly on Epstein, did you ever meet Jeffrey Epstein?
I did. In fact, I'm in his black book. And I regularly get sort of assailed on social media for being in his black book.
And how did you meet him? Why did you meet him?
Well, I met him once, and what happened was I was going to New York. Rarely I was alone. I wasn't with Tony or family or whatever, because I was going to a funeral of a friend. And on the plane, sidles alongside me, Ghislaine Maxwell.
Oh my goodness, yes, his
Who
girlfriend. And of course you work for Robert Maxwell.
I knew Ghislaine very well.
Right.
So Ghislaine says to me, we hadn't seen her for a few years. What are you doing? What are you up to? We chatted away, blah, 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 blah. And then she said, why are you going to New York? I'm going to a funeral. What are you doing this evening? I said, well, I was just going to check into my hotel, and then the funeral's tomorrow, and then I'm going back to London. And she said, oh, well, and I remember this specifically. Why don't you come and meet my boyfriend?
Yep.
So she said boyfriend. She definitely said boyfriend. Yeah, okay, I can do that. So I went in, checked in, and then I went round, and it was the house where Prince Andrew was.
That enormous townhouse
big
in New York
door
that we keep seeing the front of. In my
you see the front, and there's my Prince Andrew sort of
and it says
poking his head around.
J.E. on the side of the wall.
Right, went up to where he was in this huge room, lots of kind of very fancy art, amazing furniture, lots of pictures of him with some of these people that you've talked about. Possibly the biggest name dropper I've ever been with. I had no sense of all the stuff that we then came to, that we now know, and that lots of people presumably already did know. Ghislaine disappeared for about an hour. And then she came back and sort of, how you guys
And when was this? Can you remember roughly how long ago?
Oh, God, it was sort of early 2000s.
Right.
I think. So 20 years ago, maybe?
So quite a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing I just want to sort of, at the heart of this scandal is that he was successfully prosecuted in Florida, and the big stories started coming out sort of 2005-06. The astonishing thing is that all these people continued to see him years after.
And fly with him and get sponsors and all that stuff.
And I was sort of wondering about the psychology of this. Is it that if you've known somebody like Ghislaine Maxwell for a long time, or Epstein for a long time, you sort of don't quite want to believe what's coming out? I mean, because she also now appears to be complicit in
and she's now serving a very long jail sentence. I can't pretend I had an instinct about this guy's a horrific kind of sex offender, and Ghislaine is trying to get young women. I didn't have that sense at all. However, he gave me the creeps.
Right.
But he gave me the creeps largely because he just was one of those people. If you said, well, I had a phone call with, I don't know, Javier Solana.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I know Javier. Last time I saw it. He just, any name you mentioned, he knew him. He was just a sort of show off. And there was something creepy about him. The other thing I remember him is he sat behind the desk.
Oh, talked to you from behind his desk.
Yeah.
It's a very weird thing to do.
So it's a bit weird as well. To be honest, partly because I was knackered, I didn't really want to hang around. And so when Ghislaine came back, he said, anyway, it's been nice seeing you, and off I went. That was it. But because I think the thing about the Black Book, so-called, he's a collector of people. Yeah. So, he gets your number, he gets your email, it's in his book.
And there's part of protection mechanisms.
Yeah, and that was the only contact I ever had with him. But looking back, I can see he was a real operator. Yeah.
Well, one of the tricks he did to protect himself is that it is philanthropic fundraising, which is a big deal in the US. So he would commit to give money, for example, to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Media Lab. He would say, I'll give it anonymously, so you don't need to get in trouble from taking the money from me. And by the way, I'm also going to arrange for Bill Gates to give money too. And he'd insist that other billionaires would come and meet him on his island in order to put this money together, which kept his reputation, his name alive for many years after this prosecution through philanthropic fund.
But I wonder, when the history is written about the Trump presidency, I know not all billionaires are terrible people, right? But when you've got so many of these really wealthy people kind of as part of the mix, they basically think they're untouchable. And Epstein definitely thought he was untouchable.
And then the swing around is that Musk did a lot of campaigning for Trump, saying the reason why billionaires are supporting Democrats is they were on Epstein's list. Yeah. So these stories, these narratives are incredibly powerful, I think, in the way they fuel political change, as well as being horrors in terms of the incredible abuse of young, vulnerable, underage women. Okay. Alastair, thank you for that.
See you soon.